and good evening. I'm Tammy Ben Chaim, Minister for Public Diplomacy at the Embassy of Israel here in Washington, D.C. And I would like to thank you all for joining us as we commemorate 25 years since the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Tonight, November 4th, marks exactly 25 years to the day in the Gregorian calendar since that terrible night when a fellow Jew killed the Prime Minister of Israel over a political dispute, threatening to tear apart the foundation of Israel's democracy. We commemorate his death, one of the most traumatic events in the history of the State of Israel, every year. But this year, marking a quarter of a century, a passing of a generation, feels different. For many of us, Rabin's death marked a personal trauma. We remember exactly where we were, whom we were with, what we felt when we heard that he had been shot. When we heard those terrible words, the government of Israel announces in deep dismay, in great sadness, and in deep sorrow, the death of Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin, who was murdered by an assassin tonight in Tel Aviv. But now, 25 years later, for so many, it is no longer a personal moment or memory. There is an entire generation of Israelis who have grown up, gone to school, served in the army, and moved on with their lives, for whom Rabin is not a personal memory. For that reason, I feel that it is especially important for us here at the Embassy that we not only commemorate the event as a tragedy, among a long list of tragedies in Jewish history, but also take the time to remember Yitzhak Rabin, the man who did as much as anyone to shape the state of Israel, symbolizing the new Israeli. A man born in Jerusalem, deeply connected to the land itself, a man who embodied the need for strength and a new breed of Jewish warriors, but who also epitomized our eternal yearning for peace and the risks that we are willing to take to get there. As such, it is my great honor to introduce Ambassador Ron Dermer, who is serving as Ambassador of Israel to the United States, just as Rabin did back in 1968.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in the life of a nation that are never forgotten. Moments when all who share that nation's destiny remember exactly where they were when they heard dramatic news. Since World War II, 3 such moments have stood out in the life of America: the assassination of President Kennedy, the small step and giant leap of Neil Armstrong, and the horrific attacks of 9/11. In the life of Israel, 3 such moments have also stood out. May 14th, 1948, the day David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence. Yom Kippur, 1973, the day 2 Arab armies launched a surprise attack on the holiest day of the Jewish year. And November 4th, 1995, the day a single Jew fired 3 bullets on the darkest night in Israel's history. When those bullets were fired, I was studying in my dorm room at Oxford University. A fellow student barged in and told me Rabin had been shot. My insides turned into a knot. In that age before cell phones, my friend and I took the elevator down to the lobby to watch the only television in our building. In what seemed like an agonizingly long ride, I prayed for 2 things. First, that Rabin would live. Second, that his would-be assassin was not a Jew. Neither prayer was answered. When I moved to Israel a year later, I hoped that mourning Rabin's assassination would be something that would bring all of Israel together. But it didn't. And unfortunately, for the past 25 years, it hasn't. No doubt the main reason is that the fierce political issues surrounding his assassination have not yet been resolved. But for me, Rabin's assassination is about much more than the vision he championed or the motives of his assassin. For me, the tragedy is very simple. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister of the one and only Jewish state, and he was murdered by a Jew. The sages of our people tell us that baseless hatred led to the destruction of the Second Temple and the loss of Jewish sovereignty at the hands of the Romans. It took the Jewish people 2,000 years to return to our land and restore our sovereignty. And yet, within a few decades of Israel's rebirth, a Jew, a religious Jew, no less, murders the prime minister of Israel. Perhaps in time, the full extent of this tragedy will bring all Israelis together. You might think that if it hasn't happened in the past 25 years, it will never happen. But though 25 years may seem like a long time, it's a blink of an eye in the life of the Jewish people. Just think about this. Every year, observant Jews across the world fast on the day after Rosh Hashanah. It is called the fast of Gedaliah. Most people don't know who Gedaliah was or why he was murdered. But most of those who fast know that Gedaliah was the Jewish governor of Judea who was assassinated by another Jew. And 2,500 years later, some 2 million Jews fast and remember him. I hope Yitzhak Rabin will be remembered not just in another 25 years, but in another 2,500 years. I hope his memory will always remind us that political opponents are not enemies, and that there is no cause that justifies murder. But tonight should not just be about mourning Yitzhak Rabin's tragic death. It should also be about celebrating his remarkable life, a life dedicated to serving our country. That service came in many forms. First and foremost, Rabin was a defender of Israel. As a young soldier tasked with opening the road to Jerusalem during our War of Independence. As the IDF's chief of staff during the miraculous Six-Day War. And as the prime minister who ordered the strike on Entebbe. Second, Rabin was a builder of Israel's national strength. As an officer and defense minister, he focused on enhancing Israel's military capabilities. And as an ambassador, he focused on helping turn America's long-standing moral commitment to Israel into a strategic partnership. Third, Rabin was a peacemaker who signed Israel's peace treaty with Jordan and who tried to achieve a historic peace with the Palestinians. Ladies and gentlemen, I never met Yitzhak Rabin, but my parents did. In 1968, after he had just begun his tenure as Israel's ambassador to the United States, Yitzhak Rabin traveled to Miami Beach for the Republican National Convention. At the time, my father was the mayor, and together with my Sabra-born mother, they hosted Rabin for breakfast in our home. A few years later, my parents were in Israel, and they went to visit Rabin, who was then prime minister. They presented him with both a tennis racket and a bright red phone. A red phone which my father had on his desk when he served as mayor. Rabin loved both gifts. He said he hoped to use the tennis racket often and the red phone only in emergencies. 45 years after that meeting, I am privileged to serve as Israel's ambassador to the United States. And when I am called today to answer the red phone in our embassy, I often think of the shy and steely figure who once served as Israel's ambassador here. I think about the soldier who led Israel in war. I think about the statesmen who work to achieve peace. I think about the remarkable man whose death we mourn today and whose life was a blessing to the Jewish people and to the Jewish state. May his memory be blessed. Yehi zichro baruch.
Senator Ben Cardin and Senator Rob Portman have introduced Senate Resolution 745, honoring the life and legacy of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The bill, that has been co-sponsored by a group of bipartisan legislators, recognizes the work that Prime Minister Rabin did to advance the cause of peace throughout his life and his efforts to bring the United States and Israel ever closer. We thank the senators for their work on this resolution and for their efforts to advance the Israel-U.S. relationship.
Shalom, I'm Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, and I'm honored to join you to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. 2.5 decades after his death, the loss of this war hero turned champion for peace still weighs heavily on our hearts. During a time of incredible violence, distrust, and fear, Yitzhak Rabin envisioned a future full of compassion and opportunity for Israelis and Palestinians. He devoted his life to achieving that future, teaching us along the way how to best address conflict through dialogue, openness, and civility. I am proud to have introduced Senate Resolution 745, honoring the life and legacy of this remarkable leader. Rabin's most precious dream, of course, was one that he never saw realized: 2 states, a Jewish state, a Palestinian state, living side by side in peace. It is our responsibility to carry on his legacy by keeping this dream alive. The special relationship between the United States and Israel remains strong and is a driving force in our desire to see a lasting peace in the region. It was Rabin who once said, "The one radical solution is peace." In his memory, let us keep striving together to secure a peaceful, prosperous future for all. Thank you.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. I'm very pleased to be with you today to help honor the legacy of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and his many historic accomplishments. He was a patriot, a man of great principles, and an accomplished diplomat who tirelessly dedicated his life in search of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict and bringing lasting peace to the Middle East. It was my honor to join my friend, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, in leading a bipartisan resolution in the United States Senate honoring his memory. Today, as we commemorate the 25th anniversary of his untimely passing, we recognize his many notable achievements, including the signing of the Oslo Accords and the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. At the time of the signing of the peace treaty with Jordan, Prime Minister Rabin remarked that, quote, "There is only one radical means of sanctifying human lives, not armored plating or tanks or planes or concrete fortifications. The one radical solution is peace," end quote. For his efforts in bringing peace to both Arabs and Israelis alike, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I will close with Prime Minister Rabin's last words, which are just as powerful and relevant today as they were 25 years ago. At a peace rally in Tel Aviv, he said, and I quote, "I have always believed that the majority of the people want peace and are prepared to take risks for peace. Peace is what people aspire to." And I would add that peace is what people around the world aspire to. And Prime Minister Rabin's actions and legacy will continue to serve as a guide for all of us well into the future. Thanks again for inviting me to speak and to honor this great man. May we all try to live by the example that he set.
Hareut, the friendship. One of Israel's most well-known songs and a favorite of Prime Minister Rabin's. Written by Chaim Guri after the War of Independence, it talks about friendship and loss, of memory of loved ones, and those who will always remember them. Sung by our very own Shiri Cohen, part of our embassy family.
הנגב יורד ליל הסתיו ומצית כוכבים חרש חרש את הרוח עובר על הסף עננים מהלכים על הדרך כבר שנה לא הרגשנו כמעט איך עברו הזמנים בשדותינו כבר שנה ונותרנו מעט מרבים שאינם כבר בינינו אך נזכור את כולם את יפי הבלורית והתואר כי רעות שכזאת לעולם לא תיתן את ליבנו לשכוח אהבה מקודשת בדם אל תשובי בינינו לפרוח הרעות נשנאוך בלי מילים אפורה עקשנית ושותקת מלילות האימה הגדולים את נותרת בהירה ודולקת הרעות כנערייך כולם שוב בשמך נחייך ונלכה כי רעים שנפלו על חרבם את חייך הותירו לזכר אך נזכור את כולם את יפי הבלורית והתואר כי רעות שכזאת לעולם לא תיתן את ליבנו לשכוח אהבה מקודשת בדם אל תשובי בינינו לפרוח אהבה מקודשת בדם אל תשובי בינינו לפרוח
I, military ID number 30743, retired general in the Israel Defense Forces in the past, consider myself to be a soldier in the army of peace today. I, who served my country for 27 years as a soldier, I say to you, to your Majesty, the King of Jordan, I say to you, our American friends, today we are embarking on a battle which has no dead and no wounded, no blood and no anguish. This is the only battle which is a pleasure to wage, the battle for peace.
Our next guest, Ambassador Dennis Ross, is one of the people who knew Yitzhak Rabin best. Thank you for joining us here this evening to share your insights and reflections about Yitzhak Rabin. To open our discussion, can you please share with us the Yitzhak Rabin you knew and worked with, his personality traits, and the beliefs that drove him?
One of the things I was struck by always about Yitzhak Rabin is that he may have been the most analytical leader I ever dealt with. And what I mean by that is when you would have a conversation with him, he would lay out exactly what he thought was going on. He would be very precise and systematic. It was not unusual for him to say A, B, C, D as he talked through an issue. One of the things I was always struck by with him was not only that analytical ability and a very logical mind, But if he had thought something through and you disagreed and tried to persuade him, you had no chance. He would not budge. He had thought it through. This is what he thought was right. But if it turned out that you disagreed with him, and events later on proved that you were right and he had been wrong, he's the only leader I ever dealt with who would come back and say, you were right and I was wrong. And I'll give you one example of this. In late 1987, after the beginning of what became the first Intifada, he came to Washington, D.C., and he was meeting with, at the time he was meeting with Colin Powell, who was the national security advisor, and I was the senior Middle East person on the NSC at the time. And so I was sitting in the meeting, Rabin was there with the military attaché and Powell and me. And he was going through and explaining how what was happening with these Palestinian riots, it would go away soon. It wasn't sustainable. Israel would exert pressure on them and it wouldn't last. And I had just traveled throughout the West Bank not long before. And I said to him, I disagree. When I was there, I found a level of frustration and alienation I really haven't seen before. And I think you're going to find this is much more deeply rooted. And it's not simply going to disappear. And he said, no, you'll see. I saw him a couple months later in Israel. And one of the first things he said to me was, you were right and I was wrong. And I can tell you, in my experience of the leaders that I worked for and others that I negotiated with, I don't have any other examples of them saying to me, you were right and I was wrong. And that was Rabin. Rabin was intellectually honest. Rabin was the kind of guy who couldn't tell a lie to begin with. But in addition to that, he was honest with himself. And that was something that always came through. One other point I want to make, I would see him on Shabbat afternoons at his home on Rav Ashi in Ramat Aviv. And when I would see him, and this was a pretty regular occurrence when I was in the region, we would meet during the course of the week and we would deal with whatever the issue was. In the negotiations, I would be raising what I was doing with Arafat or what I was doing with Assad, trying to get, talking about what I thought it was important for Israel to be doing. He would raise what he thought we should be doing and so forth. That's what would take place during the week. But when he would want me to come and see him on Shabbat afternoons, frequently it would just be the two of us, and he would want to talk about the region much more broadly. He wouldn't want to talk about the specifics of what was going on. He'd want to talk about, from a strategic standpoint, what were the bigger issues. And he would give his impressions and he would sort of solicit mine. And this was a kind of, again, it was a reminder of who Rabin was. Rabin was constantly looking at reality and trying to understand it. This was a person who was extremely practical, but he also saw reality as it was, and he tried to understand it as best he could. Even if it was a reality he wanted to change, he felt he needed to understand it first. And he is not someone, I would say, he was not only intellectually honest with himself, he never kidded himself. He never pretended things were better than they were.
May I do a big switch and for our final question tonight, ask you something more personal about the moment that you heard about the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Could you share with us where were you? How did it affect you then? And what do you carry with you still today from that moment?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say it's a moment that frankly has never left me. I remember everything about it. Now, what's ironic is it was a Saturday morning here, and I had to take one of my kids to the dentist. And so I was coming back from the dentist's office, driving back, and I was paged. And it's a Saturday morning. Nothing was particularly going on. This was 6 weeks after we had finished the interim agreement. No implementation was going to take place, until at least another month. So there were no pressing issues. And I figured, this is just I'm being paged. I'll wait. I won't call while I'm still in the car. I'll wait to get home to call. And I walk in the door, and my wife says, "Look, they're calling nonstop for you. And she says to me, Rabin has been shot. And I was almost in a state of shock over that. So I called in, and by the time I called in, I was told that, and I was talking to Secretary Christopher, and he said, look, Rabin has died. So I was immediately dictating the statement that we were going to make, and also going through, or a decision we'll have to make about the president going to the funeral. And I was doing it almost by instinct and reflex. But the more I was describing, and more I was just dictating and describing who he was, the more I was overcome with emotion. And it was the first time my kids ever saw me cry. It was, it's to this day, it's still hard for me to talk about.
I got chills, and I started remembering my own, the personal moments, and I think it will be, as you said, in our hearts, in our minds, for the rest of our lives, perhaps. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and for your very interesting analysis, and for sharing with us. Thank you, Ambassador Ross.
Glad to do it. Thank you for having me.
We thank all of you for joining us tonight in our commemoration of 25 years since the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. We honor his life and his legacy and his path in attempting to achieve peace. May his memory always be a blessing. Toda v'shalom.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.